Okay, so we are going to continue on with our Vimshottari Nakshatra Dashas course, the free course here on YouTube. And we're going to continue with the fifth house. Now, I'm going to go ahead and combine the fifth house principles that we have here along with this example chart. And then for the sixth house, I'll do the same thing. So we're following the same format, just in a little bit different order than I have been with the first and second house and third and fourth house. All right, so let's begin here. So first of all, we want to consider, what does the fifth house represent? Well, the fifth house itself is said to deal with future knowledge, one's legacy or one's children, or that which one passes on, a capacity for positive change, the heart, the belly, and the intelligence. Now, these principles that what I have here that I've typed out from going through Sarvarta Chintamani, they relate more towards children and to one's intelligence. They don't go so much into the heart and the belly and these sorts of things. But again, as with previous videos on this topic, listen to the principles behind what's being shared here, because those same principles can be applied to the other things that the fifth house represents. Again, future knowledge, one's legacy, the things one passes on, one's children, the heart, the belly, the mind, the intelligence, all of this. And if you need some more information on what the fifth house represents, you can go back on this channel, youtube.com/Orion's Vedic Astrology, to the free 52 series, 52 videos, Introductory to Vedic Astrology class. There is a video specifically on each house, and the fifth house is there too, so you can learn more about it through that. But let's go ahead and get to the topics here. So what's the first thing that is described? Well, Mercury is said to give mathematical skills and scientific skills, so scientific and mathematical intelligence. So we're starting essentially with the kinds of intelligence that each planet gives when influencing the fifth house. Jupiter gives intuition, the capacity to know things without logicking through it or reasoning through it. The fifth house represents the future, and the ninth house represents knowledge of the past. So if you have the fifth house strong, then that can show a person who has the capacity to better anticipate the future, or if you're an astrologer, to predict the future. The ninth house, that can give knowledge of one's past, past lives, or just knowing past circumstances that a person has gone through. Combinations of Mercury and Jupiter with the fifth house and the ascendant and its lord contribute to astrological knowledge. So let's take a look at this chart here. Let's see if this chart has it. And I just picked this chart out randomly, just so we can use it as an example to see what's there and what's not, because this is how it's going to be as you study charts. So the combinations of Mercury and Jupiter. So is Mercury and Jupiter combined? Not necessarily, although Mercury is in Jupiter's sign. Let's check the planetary aspects. So Jupiter's aspecting Mercury to 48 points. All right, so there is an aspect of Jupiter to Mercury. Is Mercury aspecting Jupiter? Only to 11 points out of 60. So we see combinations a little bit of Mercury and Jupiter. And now we go with the fifth house. Is it with the fifth house? Well, this person's fifth house is Saturn. Fifth house lord is Saturn. Now, do we see combinations of these planets with Saturn? Not particularly. Saturn's not in Mercury or Jupiter's sign. Saturn is getting impacted by Jupiter at 37 points, Mercury to 31 points. I would look to this a little more detailed about astrological knowledge if Mercury and Jupiter were more directly aspecting Saturn, the fifth lord, or if they were together in combination through a yoga. And the ascendant lord, which is Venus. And here we have Venus in the fourth house. So this person has some combinations that could point in that direction, but really we'd be stretching it to try to say that that would be the case. And this person is not an astrologer. They do like astrology, though. Other things we need to consider. Benefics on the fifth house, its lord and Jupiter, along with beneficial placements in the Rashi and Navamsha by house and sign, gives capacity to give and get good counsel. So benefic or gentle planets, we know what those are based on our past studies. If they influence the 5th house, the Lord of the 5th house, and Jupiter, and the 5th house, its Lord and Jupiter, are in beneficial placements in the Rashi and Navamsha by house and sign, this gives capacity to give and get good counsel. Next, issues of progeny or children, and in Sarvarta Chintamani they only say son, so we can tell that in this particular culture that sons were very important, but we have to update things a bit, and so we're going to look to children in general. But benefic influences on the 5th house, we've just done that. The next one. Issues of progeny can be considered from the 7th, 5th, 9th houses in Jupiter. Intelligence is determined from the 5th house in Mercury. So if you want to know what is the likelihood that a person's going to have progeny or children, you need to look at the 7th house, the 5th house, and the 9th house. Why is that? Well, the 7th house in anyone's chart, and in this chart we have Libra ascendant, so 7th house is Aries. That shows the capacity to connect with someone sexually. Oftentimes people say the 8th house, but that's really the conjugal bond after marriage. But sex is the 7th house. And you need to have sex typically to have a child. I realize there are things that you can do otherwise, but we're not going to be completely traditional in analyzing this text because obviously we're changing sons to progeny. But we're going to keep it a little bit traditional. We have to have the 5th house well supported. Why the 5th house? Because that is the house specifically for children. And the 9th house, well, the 9th is the 5th from the 5th. And that's a principle called Bhavat Bhavam. And that helps us to see how is the idea of children itself supported, the capacity to pass on one's genes and DNA and bloodline. Because the 9th is often considered to be one's grandchildren. And so, again, you can't have grandchildren typically unless you have children. So 5th house is children, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 away is grandchildren. So we can look at it, we can start to see the reasoning behind it in this way. Now, intelligence is determined from the 5th house and Mercury. Now, why are we making these delineations? Because if we want to know about a person's intelligence, we look at the 5th house and Mercury. If we want to know about a person's capacity for children or their children, we look at the 5th house, the 7th, the 9th, and Jupiter, right? Because Mercury is a karaka of intelligence, an indicator of intelligence, and Jupiter is primarily a karaka of children. So we have to learn to delineate in this regard. Now, if a benefic occupies the 5th house and is aspected by a benefic, while the Lord of the 5th is a benefic, also under aspect of a benefic, one has the capacity to have children. That makes clear sense. Because we have the 5th house and the Lord of the 5th, aspected by gentle or benefic planets. This gives ease typically in manifesting children, all other things being equal. Now, there's often the thought that having the 5th Lord in the 5th or having Jupiter in the 5th is bad for children. The only reason that comes about, the logic behind it, again, we have to start to think like an astrologer, is because if you have the 5th Lord, which is an indicator for children, in the 5th house, a house representative of children, and Jupiter, a natural karaka of children, so whatever influences are hitting that, for good or for ill, are going to be triply felt, because you've got 3 things altogether that represent children. So if you have malefic, cruel influences to that 5th house, where the 5th Lord is and Jupiter may be, and you have three things representing children getting hurt all at the same time. So that's the confluence that makes it worse. But it can go either way, hence this phrase here that we just went over. Now, there are some other things that show about children. In Sarvarta Chintamani, it gives quite a long list of them, and I'm going to name them for you. So these are the things that you're going to want to check. And there is a long list, but the more you see these in a person's chart, the more it speaks to having children, happiness of children. Right? That's how astrology works. The more you see something overlapping, the more likely it is to occur. And when you go into a dasha of a planet in regards to what we're describing here, like a planet of Jupiter or the fifth lord, or benefics, Rashi aspecting the fifth house. When you go into a dasha of that planet, that's when these things are going to get activated. So this is how we can apply this to the dashas. We need to know, first of all, what's in the chart, and then we need to wait and look for the dasha that supports it. And you also need to look at transits as well. Those of you who want to go very deeply into the dashas or to the transits, please go to AshevilleVedicAstrology.com, my website, and go to the courses page, MP3 audio and video courses. And there are courses there on the Vimshottari Dasha system, and that will go over how to use dashas very well along with transits to increase the accuracy of your astrological assessments. And it's fairly complicated, so brace yourself for that. But I found that that's the best way to do astrology, is to go into those kinds of details. So anyway, back to this idea of children. Now, let's look at this person's chart before we go into this. So their Jupiter is with Ketu, it's in the 8th house. Jupiter rules the 3rd and the 6th. The 5th lord is Saturn, and the Putrakaraka, Jaiminikaraka for children, is Saturn. So Saturn's a double significator for children in this person's chart. All right. So Saturn's going to be a planet they're going to pay a lot of attention to. Let's see how it works out in regards to these principles. So Jupiter being aspected by benefics. Well, in this chart, Jupiter is aspected by the Moon to 23 points out of 60, Mercury to 11 points out of 60, Venus to 23 points out of 60. But there's actually more malefic influences towards that Jupiter. So it's going to cause some difficulty with children. The Lagna Lord is in the 5th, the Lord of the 5th and Jupiter are strong. Well, the Lagna Lord's not in the 5th. Saturn has some difficulties with dignity here. He's in a great enemy sign. And Jupiter is in the 8th house with Ketu, so that's going to give some weakness. The Lord of the 1st and 5th in the same house or aspect in each other or in each other's sign. All right, well, we don't see that. Lord of the 5th and 1st in the same house or aspect in each other and in each other's sign. So the Lord of the 1st is Venus, the Lord of the 5th is Saturn. Let's see how they're aspecting each other. So Venus is aspecting Saturn to 46 points out of 60. Okay, well, that's got an aspect. And Venus is getting aspected by Saturn to 2 points out of 60. So it's not that strong, although Venus is in Saturn's sign, but it's not in the 5th house. The Lord of the Navamsha, occupied by the 5th Lord, situated and aspected by a benefic. Now we have to think about this. And remember, these are all going to be on my website in the blog post for the 5th house, so you can go look at that. I'm going to print all these up for you so that you can review them. But what is this saying? The Navamsha Lord of the 5th, the Navamsha Lord of the 5th Lord is in the Lagna. So the Navamsha Lord of the 5th Lord. That means we find the 5th Lord, which is Saturn, and now we look for it in the Navamsha. Let's see here. So Saturn goes into Virgo in the Navamsha. The Lord of the Navamsha, occupied by the 5th Lord, situated and aspected by a benefic. So what we're looking for is not the 5th Lord in the Navamsha. We want the Lord of the 5th Lord in the Navamsha, which is Mercury, and see where does it go in the birth chart. Is it situated or aspected by a benefic? Well, it's Rashi aspected by the Moon, which is a benefic in this particular situation, but it's with the Sun and Mars. So that's going to hurt this case towards children. The Navamsha Lord of the 5th Lord is in the Lagna. So the Navamsha Lord of the 5th Lord is in the Lagna. That's not there. The Navamsha Lord of the Lagna Lord is in the 5th. So again, we find Venus, the Lagna Lord, in the Navamsha, which is Mercury again, because Venus is in Gemini in the Navamsha. And we see if it goes into the 5th. It does not. And the Navamsha Lord of Jupiter is in a Kendra. So we need to find Jupiter in the Navamsha, which is, he's in Leo in the Navamsha, ruled over by the Sun. And the Sun is not in a Kendra. So these are the complicated little things you have to look for to go a little bit deeper into a person's chart, but they're very important. All right, let's continue on. So the 5th house and 5th lord, hemmed in by malefics, and Jupiter with malefics gives destruction to progeny. So the 5th house and 5th lord hemmed in by malefics. Well, the 5th house is not hemmed in by malefics here. It's got Moon and Venus hemming in the 5th house. The 5th lord is also not hemmed in by malefics. However, Jupiter is with malefics. It's with Ketu, which can give destruction to progeny. But that's only one aspect of that particular combination. So continuing on. The Navamsha lords of the 5th, 7th, and 9th houses, located in a malefic Navamsha and situated with malefics, gives destruction of progeny. Again, we'd have to do the same thing here, where we'd find the Navamsha lords of the 5th house, the 7th house, and the 9th house in the birth chart. See if the Navamsha lords of those planets are located in a malefic Navamsha and situated with malefics. This gives destruction of progeny. And you would look, if you found that, then you would figure out what planets are those. And then you would figure out when might that Dasha run of the 5th lord, the 7th lord, the 9th house lord, the Navamsha lords of these planets. Because that would show difficulty to progeny, or difficulty having children, or stress to the children during that particular Dasha of those planets. Now, difficulty to children is also indicated by these principles. The 5th lord is in a malefic Navamsha. In its sign of debilitation is eclipse, aspected by malefics, or in the 6th, 8th, or 12th. Let's find the 5th lord. Is it in a malefic Navamsha? Well, the 5th lord is Saturn. It goes into Mercury. Mercury itself is a benefic, so it's not in a malefic Navamsha. Is it in its sign of debilitation? No. Is it eclipsed? No. Is it aspected by malefics? Well, it does have aspect from Sun to 25 points out of 60, Mars to 25 points out of 60. But it's got pretty strong positive aspects from these other benefic planets. It's not located in the 6th, 8th, or 12th. Now, the Lord of the 5th is in the 6th, 8th, or 12th, aspected by malefics, and in a malefic Shashtiamsha. Well, in this chart, the Lord of the 5th is not in the 6th, 8th, or 12th, so we're not going to follow that any further. But if you did, then you would pull up the Shashtiamsha, the D60, and see if that were true. And even if we followed it, we would see that while Saturn, the 5th Lord, is in neutral dignity in the Shashtiamsha, the D60, it's still in a friend sign. And a benefic planet, no less. Venus is sign, Taurus there. Now, in Sarvarta Chintamani, it goes on to say that indications for children should be considered after looking at indications for destruction or creation of the family first. Makes perfect sense. Are you going to be able to have a family first? Are you going to be able to support a family? That's where all this comes from. This is where it gets a little more tricky. So these are the kinds of things where you have to stop the recording and think about what has been said, or go to my website and find this blog on the 5th house and read over what has been said and contemplate what are the principles behind what is being shared here. Because only by contemplating those things will you understand astrologically what's going on, which will make you a much better astrologer, rather than just scratching your head and blowing it all off because you can't quite follow logic. You have to learn to follow the logic. So destruction or inability to create a family may occur if the following be true. Now you got to listen to this. I'm going to take it slow. Think about it. The moon is located in the 10th. Venus is in the 7th. Malefic's in the 4th house. The Lord of the Lagna with Mercury. Now, that's a long list of things, and too many people read these old books and they read that and they say, well, gee, how am I supposed to know that? Well, part of the reason the books are written this way is to get you thinking about the logic behind it. So you don't need that formula, but you understand the principles behind it. So let's describe that. So the moon is in the 10th. Well, in this chart, the moon is not in the 10th. But let's pretend it was. If the moon was in the 10th house, then the moon, if the moon was in the 10th house, then from the 5th house, the moon would be in the 6th from the 5th. Here's the 10th, here's the 5th. If the moon were here, it would be in the 6th from the 5th. And it's said that the moon in any house, the moon in the 6th from any house, shortens the longevity of the person indicated by that house. Why? Because the moon is one's capacity to grow. And if the moon is in a 6th house from another house, then whoever the house the moon is 6th from will have difficulty growing appropriately, which is why the moon is often related to hormonal issues or growth problems. But it goes on, it says Venus is in the 7th and Malefic's in the 4th house. Well, if we have Venus in the 7th, which we don't in this chart, and Malefic's in the 4th, well then what happens is we end up having these malefics in an angle to Venus. And why is Venus so important? Because Venus is our capacity for sexuality. But Venus, on a deeper level, is our capacity to pass on our genes. It's our genetics, right? So Jupiter is our creativity, but Venus is actually our DNA, which is why the father is often represented by Venus in certain texts. And so if there are malefic planets in an angle from Venus, then that's going to hurt the capacity for Venus to do its thing, which is pass on its genetics and be able to connect with someone sexually. Now, we also need to consider this idea of the Lord of the Lagna with Mercury. Well, the Lord of the Lagna represents you. And when we have Mercury with the Lord of the Lagna, sometimes we have to look at other things within the chart, but that can show a person who might be somewhat asexual or sterile. Why? Because both Saturn and Mercury are sterile planets. They're neuter planets. All right, so we have to see all these things together and understand what is the logic behind them, which allows us to see why they work this way. So you might want to rewind and write these things down, or again, go to AstralVedicAstrology.com and find the blog post where this is written out. So there's more. Malefics in the 12th, 5th, or 8th gives difficulty creating a supportive environment for children. Now, why is that? So malefics in the 12th, 5th, or 8th gives difficulty creating a supportive environment for children. Because the 12th afflicts the 8th from the 5th. The 5th will afflict progeny itself. And the 8th afflicts the 2nd house of family. So it gives difficulty being able to meet the responsibilities needed to provide for a child. It doesn't mean you can't have children, but again, we have to remember this book was written in a very traditional culture. And is it recommended to have children when you can't support them or you can't have a supportive environment? Well, everyone's got their own karma, and a child's going to be born to you if you have that because they have a karma to work out in that way. But this is one of those principles to consider. Now, if we have Moon and Jupiter in the ascendant and Saturn and Mars in the 7th, again, Saturn and Mars in the 7th, that's going to afflict our capacity to be able to relate to someone, to be able to have sex, to be able to have a relationship, because Mars and Saturn's going to give a lot of frustration in the area of sexuality and relationships in the 7th. And if we have Moon and Jupiter in the ascendant, well, even though that is kind of a good thing, but now we have Mars and Saturn 7 houses away from Moon and Jupiter, which will also be aspecting Moon and Jupiter and therefore hurting the capacity to grow of the Moon and the capacity to be creative of Jupiter, and also the natural capacity to nurture the Moon and the natural capacity for children to come into the world in the first place, right? So Mars and Saturn in the 7th, Jupiter and Moon in the 1st. That Mars and Saturn is going to be hitting multiple issues of progeny, both the 7th house, the capacity to do the action that creates them, and also that Moon and Jupiter, which is going to hurt karakas, indicators that are necessary to have children in the first place. Now, the Lord of the 5th house in the 5th and devoid of strength. So we come back again to this Lord of the 5th house. And if the Lord of the 5th is in the 5th, yet devoid of strength or significantly starved by its enemies, then you're going to have problems. Now, a weak Moon in the 1st and Jupiter in a sign of Saturn with Saturn. Why is that? Well, number one, if Jupiter is in a sign of Saturn, if he's in Capricorn, he's debilitated. If he's in Aquarius and he's with Saturn, again, that Lajatati Avashta of starvation comes into play. Saturn starves any planet that he's with, and when he's in his own sign, he is powerful, which means he can significantly starve that Jupiter. And the weak moon, again, the capacity for our hormones to support growth, or our capacity to nurture and be nurturing to a child. And this will be applicable to creativity as well. And it can give difficulty with one's mind as well, right? Because if Jupiter is starved by Saturn, then the person doesn't think positively or is always focused on dogma, Jupiter and Saturn together, or they're so stuck in tradition that they can't quite see or evolve, see things getting better or improving. They're just kind of stuck. It's not always the case, but that's a typical situation that occurs with Jupiter and Saturn together. But to go into more detail, you'd have to study the Vimshottari, and you've heard me talk enough about that. So you know where to find the class if you're looking for it. Now, there are other things that go on in regards to children being had with great difficulty or delay. Again, I will post these things on my website, these writings, so that you can go find them there. But let's go ahead and scroll down to the issues of intelligence to kind of round out this video. So the fifth house also deals with intelligence, the capacity to see better things, to improve one's life situation, which is one of the reasons why if you're going to prescribe remedial measures for someone or see how well remedial measures are going to work for you, you check the fifth house and Jupiter. Because if they are stressed, then it's going to take a lot more work to get the benefits from those remedial measures. And this is where a lot of astrologers make mistakes and this is why a lot of people complain about astrologers, because a lot of astrologers don't know to look to that. So they prescribe these expensive remedies, and the person comes back and complains that it doesn't work at all, so therefore astrology is total crap. Well, if the astrologer would have looked at the fifth house in Jupiter, then they could have realistically assessed what the person is going to need to do to change their life. And they would have been able to say, this is going to be hard work, and don't expect to get it just by putting it on a gemstone, or don't expect to get it just by chanting some mantras. You're going to really have to work at changing your mind, because changing the mind is the hardest thing to do, correct? That's why on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/kriyayogaonline, this month of October, the practice I recommended people to do, you can go watch that video, is on spiritual fasting, which is essentially fasting from certain thoughts. So you might want to review that to help with your fifth house if you need it. But anyway, the Navamsha Lord of the fifth in a Kendra, or trine and aspected by the Lord of the fifth, gives good intelligence. This is another thing that we have to follow it through to the Vargas. So the Navamsha Lord of the fifth, that's not saying the Lord of the fifth house. That's saying the Lord of the fifth from the birth chart. So we need to find Saturn. And we need to see, where does Saturn go in the Navamsha? So let's pull up that Navamsha again. Saturn goes into Mercury. So the Mercury, essentially, in a Kendra trine and aspected by the fifth, gives good intelligence. Well, Mercury's not in an angle or trine in this chart. Is it aspected by Saturn? To 28 points out of 60. It's not saying this person's going to be not intelligent, because they are. It's just they're not going to be the kind of person that you say, wow, this is a extremely brilliant individual. The fifth house in between benefics, the fifth house occupied by benefics, and Jupiter in a good dignity in a Kendra or trine gives wisdom, learning, and good counsel. So this person does have the fifth house between benefics, the moon and K2, that's funny, moon and Venus. The fifth house is not occupied by benefics. Jupiter is in a great enemy sign, so it's not in good dignity. So does this person get good counsel typically? Are they able to impart their learning? Well, that's not really their place in life. They don't do that, so it's not important for them. They don't impart wisdom. They're more in a service industry, which is fine. We all need that. But if you want to have a teacher, or if you want to have a someone that you get good counsel from, you might want to check to see if the fifth house is between benefics, the fifth house is occupied by benefics, and Jupiter is in a good dignity in a Kendra trine or trine. Or if you want to be a teacher, how good of a teacher are you going to be? This is going to be the best of teachers who has this. The Lord of the fifth and Mercury in many good Vargas and aspected by gentle planets gives good memory. Now that's where we have to know how to go through all of the Vargas. We could do it manually, or if you have Kala, you can just pull up the dignities in Vargas chart, and we can find the Lord of the fifth, which is Saturn in this chart. How many good Vargas is it in? Well, we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 6 Vargas. The others are neutral, great enemy sign. So that's not so stellar for the 5th Lord. Let's look at Mercury. Own home, own home, own home. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, about 6 or so, 6 to 8 good Vargas out of 16. So we wouldn't look at that so much. But if you had these things, then that would speak to having good memory, a person having good memory. The Lord of the 5th and Mercury in many good Vargas and aspected by gentle planets gives good memory. Now here is a fun one. Let's see. This deals with the Drekana. So the Drekana is important. This is why these Vargas are so important, because you have to learn to take planets through the Vargas to see how they're going to work. So the Drekana Lord of Mercury and the 5th house being a gentle planet and located in a Kendra or trine and under the aspects of gentle planets, the native understands the slightest hints. That's the kind of person that you barely have to say anything to, and they understand. They understand. They're good detectives, maybe. So let's find the Drekana Lord of Mercury. So Mercury is in Sagittarius in the birth chart. But let's find where Mercury goes in the Drekana. So Mercury is in Aries in the Drekana. So Mercury is ruled over by Mars. So the Lord of Mercury in the Drekana is Mars. And we could look at the Lord of the 5th house. But we're going to keep to this sutra, or not sutra, this verse. The Drekana Lord of Mercury and the 5th house being a gentle planet located in a Kendra or trine. So Mars, which is the Drekana Lord of Mercury, is not in a Kendra or trine. The 5th house Lord is not a gentle planet, nor is it located in a Kendra or trine. So we would not apply this to this individual. You have to explain things a little more. Next, Rahu and Saturn in the 5th, and the Lord of the 5th with a malefic. And in a malefic Shashtyamsha, one has low intelligence. Well, in this chart, Rahu and Saturn are not in the 5th. The Lord of the 5th is not with a malefic. However, we also remember that the Lord of the 5th is not in a malefic Shashtyamsha, so this does not indicate low intelligence. Now, having Rahu and Saturn in the 5th doesn't necessarily mean that the person has a low IQ. It could. We have to remember that the 5th deals with our capacity to understand things. And when Rahu and Saturn are in the 5th, the person is usually really pessimistic and kind of rigid and focused on the more negative side of life. This is just a typical thing. Because the 5th Lord, the 5th house, this shows our mentality. And when it's colored by Rahu and Saturn, you're more focused on the dark sides of life. And it doesn't have to be the macabre, but just you usually don't see the sunny side of life. And when you don't see that, you have less chance of really being successful because you miss a lot of opportunities in that regard. And sometimes that can be looked at as low intelligence. All right. But again, that can be worked with by doing mantras for Jupiter, Ganesh mantras, to help to direct you to seeing more opportunities. Doing mantras like the Gayatri mantra can be helpful for your own inner inspiration and clearing up that darkness that Saturn and Rahu can bring. So there are ways to work with it, but it does take practice and it does take time. Now, intelligence is also encumbered by the Lord of the 5th house being debilitated, or eclipsed by the sun, or located in an enemy sign, or aspected by a malefic and located in a malefic Shashtyamsha. So the Lord of the 5th is not debilitated here, nor is it eclipsed by the sun, but it is in a natural enemy sign. So we're looking at a natural enemy sign, which means that the sun can starve this Saturn. If we looked at the Vimshottari Nakshatra, we would see that. Now, Saturn in the 5th house. So if we had Saturn here, the Lagna Lord aspected by Saturn, and the Lord of the 5th associated with malefics gives difficulty with positive intellect. Again, this goes back to our other verse dealing with Rahu and Saturn. Because again, we have the 5th house, the Lord of the 5th, all under the influence of malefics. The person's going to be paying more attention to the malefic things within life. So they're a little more difficult in that regard, which is hard to have a positive intellect in that way. Now finally, a benefic located in the 5th house and aspected by Jupiter and Venus. And the Lord of the 5th is also well aspected. This gives the capacity to impart learning to others. So if we have a benefic in the 5th, which we don't in this chart, but a benefic in the 5th, and aspected by Jupiter. Let's see, is that 5th house aspected by Jupiter? Let's take a look. So here's the 5th. So Jupiter is only aspecting in 19 out of 60 points. All right, that's the specific aspectual strength. Is Venus aspecting the 5th? To 2 points out of 60, which makes sense because Venus is in the sign before the 5th house. The Lord of the 5th, also well aspected, gives capacity to impart learning to others. So again, you want to know, someone says, can I be a teacher? I want to be a teacher. I want to share things. Well, go find that and see how much of that is true, how much of that is accurate. If it's accurate, then they'll be able to impart learning well. And this is the other thing to remember as you go through these principles, is that you might not have all of them there, but you might have some of the verses that we went over. And the more you have of the verse, the more likely it's going to be true. If there's a little bit of it, it's still going to be just a little bit true. And when it comes to applying these to dashas, you need to figure out what are the planets that rules the 5th house, what are the planets that are influencing the 5th house. And when you come to a dasha of those particular planets getting simultaneously activated, then you can expect these things to give the results. And this is why the Vimshottari Mahadasha system is not as cut and dry as people seem to make it out to be, because it's not just the combination of Mercury and Sun in your chart when you're in a Mercury-Sun cycle. Maybe that Mercury and Sun is aspecting the 5th house, or maybe it's aspecting another house. So whenever that Mercury-Sun cycle runs, then you're going to need to look to see what all is Mercury and Sun doing simultaneously. And that's where you're going to get your results. So it takes a while. And it's why a lot of people make mistakes, because it's not easy. But the more meticulous you can be about it, the better you'll do. All right, so thank you very much for tuning in. Next up, I will aim to do the same kind of video with the 6th house. And be well.